Miles Taylor. He's the no longer anonymous former senior Trump administration official. You'll remember him turning the White House upside down in 2018 when he wrote that mysterious New York Times op-ed and subsequent book, A Warning, declaring he was part of the, quote, resistance working to thwart Trump's worst inclinations, and did ultimately, of course, reveal his identity. Taylor was chief of staff to Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and back with us on Primetime. It's good to see you.
Chris, thanks for having me.
Now, first, the flavor. Does this sound, as reporting, remotely like what you understand about Milley, his concerns, and what Trump could trigger in people like him?
Chris, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. And I want to say two things about it. First, it's alarming, but second, it's not surprising. The alarming piece is obvious. You hit on those points. You had the president's top military advisor, his handpicked top military advisor, by the way, who was so worried about his mental state that he wanted to basically keep the nuclear codes from him, put checks and balances in place, and talk to foreign adversaries to keep wars from breaking out. That suggests to me that the president's own top military advisor at that time didn't see Russia and China and Iran as the biggest threats to the United States. He saw the president of the United States as the biggest threat to the country. That is alarming. Two, though, Chris, why is this not surprising? Because I witnessed it. I saw cabinet secretaries in the first year of this administration talking about the potential of invoking the 25th Amendment because they were worried the president was so mentally unstable. And there's one other episode among many that I witnessed that was very similar to this Milley incident. We'd been having conversations about North Korea, and we're very worried that the president's bellicose rhetoric was going to lead to an unintentional war with North Korea. I can remember walking out of the Situation Room in a meeting, and Secretary Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, turned to me and the Secretary of Homeland Security and said, if you all aren't preparing the homeland for war, you're not doing your jobs. And he was saying, we just didn't know where this situation was going to go because the president was spiraling. That's deeply disturbing. But again, I think that reinforces what Milley saw firsthand.
All right, we'll get back to him in 1 second. Just in terms of the threat, forget about putting military in, the aspect of how dramatically he wanted to take military out. If the book is right about this secret memo to withdraw January 15, 2021, with what we just saw, with a lot of lead time in getting them out that Biden had, what do you think might have happened if the military had been pulled out that abruptly?
Well, I hate to say it, this is something that we warned Trump against in the first year. When he took office, he actually wanted to pull out that abruptly, Chris. I don't know if this has been reported yet, but he told us he wanted to pull out that abruptly at the very beginning of the administration. He just wanted to be gone from Afghanistan. And we pressed him and convinced him in August of his first year to keep a U.S. troop presence. But by the end of the administration, he'd gotten rid of the guardrails. He'd gotten rid of John Kelly, who convinced him to stay and stay the course. He'd got rid of Jim Mattis and others, and he wanted to double down on that. If he'd been able to execute that in January, the humanitarian catastrophe we saw over the course of the past month would have been on steroids. It would have been more dead Americans trying to get out of that country. It would have been an absolute nightmare. I think Milley really deserves immense credit for preventing that from having happened.
Milley deserves credit. Help us understand why what he did is okay and not maybe he had the right feelings, but is it the right way to go about it? Or are you supposed to resign and go public?
Yeah, I think that's a tough situation to be in, Chris. I mean, look, I witnessed a lot of people in it. I was in that spot myself. I think what's revealing about this episode is that the guardrails are so thin that people like General Milley, I'm sure in his case, were worried that if he left and spoke out, well, maybe a more compliant person would be put in his place who would execute a nuclear strike for the president to have cause to stay in office. And that's the dilemma that a lot of these people close to the president faced. I think the answer becomes when the president no longer will listen to your advice and will just go around you anyway, that's when it's time to go and to blow the whistle. Now, a lot of people did do that, and I think it's important that there were folks like General Milley and others who stayed till the end to keep their hands on the steering wheel as much as possible before this thing fell apart. But the fact that he was worried about the president potentially starting a war at the end of his term alarms me. And Chris, I'm going to add one more anecdote here, and that is Donald Trump talked multiple times throughout the administration to us about his powers of declaring an insurrection. He knew that if he declared an insurrection, he could deploy the military to the streets and do extraordinary things. So on January 6th, it was my supposition, as the Capitol was being stormed, that the president did want to invoke the Insurrection Act to put the military on the streets to prevent a transfer of power, because he had talked to us about it so many times. That's the type of thing that shows premeditation, in my opinion.
Two quick things. One, when did he talk about wanting to invoke the Insurrection Act early on, in terms of what context?
Well, usually it was around the border, Chris, is he would say, look, I want to seal the entire United States border. No immigrants get to come in. I've been told I've got magical powers under the Insurrection Act to do that.
He said magical powers?
Oh, he did indeed. Verbatim, those were his words, Chris. It sounds Trump-like because it was Trump's words. He said he had magical powers. He mentioned the Insurrection Act, and he said, I can use that to shut down the border. We went back to our lawyers and came to the White House and said, look, there is no insurrection at the southern border. You cannot invoke that power. But the president had the idea of insurrection in his mind. So again, that day, I'm sure he had the thought that he could use those powers if he wanted to deploy the military into the streets.
One other thing, because this is going to be a hot button, obviously. Milley having the concerns, fine. Milley wanting to do something about the concerns, fine. Milley calling his Chinese counterpart, meeting with top brass, telling the Chinese counterpart, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. I'll let you know if we're going to attack you. And telling the top military brass, you come to me no matter who tells you what. Do you believe that that is going too far?
Well, look, on the call with the Chinese, I think we need more information, because if Milley actually did say to a foreign adversary, I'll warn you before we hit you, and if we had a credible reason to hit an adversary, that's dangerous talk. But I don't think we have all the details yet. It sounds to me like Milley was trying to reach out to foreign counterparts to say, let's keep the temperature low. You may hear some insane rhetoric out of Washington, but let's try to keep it from going to war, much like many statesmen have throughout history to try to keep temperatures low. I hope that's the case, and I think we need to ask those questions, and I think General Milley owes answers on that front.